All right, so welcome back. Yesterday, we spent 2 hours getting into this newly released document that Jack Smith just put out, or actually that Judge Chutkan just put out. So essentially, there we have the case that is happening with Donald Trump and the election subversion and the attempt to overturn the 2020 election. And initially that he was, they brought the case, he was indicted by a grand jury, evidence went before a judge, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, hey, some of these crimes you can't charge a president for because he's immune, right? So remember that immunity, the immunity decision. Welcome everybody, welcome back. We are getting started again from where we left off yesterday. As you can see, I've added a little box here so you can see where I'm at in the document. If you want to download this document as well and read along with me as we go through, it is linked on my profile page. So just go there. The link is right there. You can click it, download it. Today we're going to get started on page 31. But just for a recap, for anybody who wasn't here yesterday or folks who slept since then and need a reminder. So what's happening is Trump is in the middle of ongoing litigation about his alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election, right? And so this has been going on for some years now, right? Initially, Jack Smith, who is a special prosecutor, indicted him with a grand jury, right? That evidence started moving through a court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was like, hey, some of these allegations that you have in here, a president is immune for because they are official acts. Most of those acts that were excised, that the court said you can't use those anymore, those were acts that involved him trying to use the Department of Justice itself in order to overturn the election, right? And so the Supreme Court was basically like, no, what needs to happen is you need to make an offer of proof. The judge in the lower court is going to need to decide up front which ones of these allegations are immune and which are not. So basically the Supreme Court was like, you need to come back with some evidence, right? They mandated that this happen. And so Jack Smith went back, took out all of the stuff about the DOJ, and has now detailed all of the evidence that he plans to submit. It's important to note that all of the witnesses, all of the evidence is from Republicans. It is from people who were in Donald Trump's own party, in his own cabinet, in his campaign, all the way up to Mike Pence, who was the vice president, right? So yesterday, what we went over for about 2 hours, we started with the opening, right? Where Jack is basically like, yo, as soon as Donald Trump saw that he was losing this election, he became desperate and resorted to crime. Right? They outlined initially, let me go through and just look at all of these different pieces because I'm obviously on page 31, right? But they started out giving you an overview of the case, naming some of those co-conspirators. In the document, it's redacted, but a lovely person on the internet has gone through and like made a list of who all these people are because it's not hard to figure this out. Now, some people are trying to falsely claim that this is election interference. It's important for us to understand that that is not the case, right? So remember, these charges date back a long time. This has been in the courts for a long time, right? In fact, it went up to the Supreme Court some months ago, and it was actually the Supreme Court that said, hey, you need to go back, file these documents, and release them. And it has been Trump's team that has been pushing for delay, right? And so now, based on that timeline, right, that the Supreme Court and Donald Trump's team got us into, now Jack Smith is making this motion in court to show the evidence that is available or that he will bring in order to prosecute Donald Trump for these crimes. And Judge Chutkan made those available to the public. So if anybody's to blame for this timing, it's actually the Supreme Court and Donald Trump's legal team. All right, so we are in the middle of the factual proffer. Remember that first Jack started out explaining the formation of the conspiracies and talked about how that actually started way before the election even started, right? When there were claims and they started out coming out and saying things like, hey, you can't trust this election, mail-in balloting is fraudulent, and he detailed all of those different quotes. And then he also went through and detailed out the fact that Trump knew that the claims that he was making were lies, right? We heard about Greg, his actual attorney, one of his attorneys who was trying to hold everybody accountable. And we also heard specifically from Mike Pence, right? So then Jack Smith goes through each of the states individually. He starts out with Arizona and then went into Georgia. When we were looking at the things that happened in Arizona, specifically on page 17 and 18, it noted, right, that Rudy Giuliani specifically said, we don't have any evidence. We've just got some wild theories that we're going to try and use. There was evidence in there about how the lawyers and Greg went to Donald Trump and were like, hey, there's no evidence here, and we're not going to be able to prove this in a court of law. And Donald Trump said, quote, the details don't matter. I don't care about those details, right? So pieces of evidence like that. We got into Georgia with the Georgia State Senate and how they were trying to make claims that 10,000 unalived voters were voting, and how that was proven false, and how it was actually only 12 because they did investigate and find out that information. All right, so now we're going to get into what happened in Michigan. So we're on page 31. Again, if you want to download this document, it's on my page in my bio. You can just click on that and you can read along with us. We're going to get started on page 31 with Michigan. All right, thank you for that gift. Definitely join the team. Thank y'all. All right, on November 20th, 3 days before Michigan's governor signed a certificate of ascertainment appointing Biden's electors based on the popular vote, the defendant met with P37, who is Mike Shirkey, and P38, who is Lee Chatfield, who is Michigan's state majority leader and the Speaker of the House, at the Oval Office. The defendant, Donald Trump, initiated the meeting by asking the RNC chairwoman, so the Republican National Committee chairwoman, who is P39, Ronna McDaniel, to reach out to P38, Lee Chatfield, who's also the Michigan House Speaker, and gauge his receptivity to a meeting. So this is them basically telling us on November 20th, 3 days before the governor is supposed to be signing and confirming Joe Biden's slate of electors, that he's trying to get the Michigan Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House on the phone. The defendant also asked P39, the RNC chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel, to participate in the meeting, but she told him that she had consulted with her attorney and that she could not be involved in a meeting with legislators because it could be perceived as lobbying. After Ronna made the first contact on November 18th, Donald Trump reached out to P37 and P38, right? Remember, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House, to extend an invitation to have a phone call with them. The same day that he contacted those individuals, Donald Trump issued a false tweet that said, quote, in Detroit, there are, all caps, far more votes than people. Nothing can be done to cure that giant scam. I win Michigan. When the defendant called the P37 and P38 to invite them to the White House, he did not provide the topic of the meeting, but he did ask about allegations of fraud in the election in Michigan. The legislators told him that they and the Michigan legislature were examining the allegations, right? So they're telling him, we're looking into this. And both of them assumed that Trump wanted to see them to discuss claims of election fraud, and they wanted to be firm that they had not seen evidence that would change the outcome of the election. For this reason, and to avoid talking only about election fraud, they prepared materials to raise regarding COVID-19 and planned in advance to release a statement once the meeting was over that said that the legislators were unaware of information that would change the outcome of the election. So here we have Donald Trump calling the thank you so much, calling the Michigan Senate Majority Leader and the Speaker of the House and trying to get them to say that there is some sort of election fraud. And he is on the phone with them saying, And he's on the phone being like, fraud is happening. And they're like, no, that's not true. We haven't found any evidence of that that's going to change the outcome of the election. We're now on the bottom of page 32. Let me make sure you can see where I am at. All right. Over the course of the meeting, Donald Trump dialed in both Rona, the RNC chairwoman, who said, I don't want to be on the phone because my lawyer said this isn't a good idea, despite her request not to participate, and also co-conspirator number 1, remember, which is Rudy Giuliani, and P21, who is Mark Meadows, who's the White House chief of staff. Both of them were present for some, but not all, of the meeting. After some small talk with the legislators in the Oval Office, the defendant raised various fraud claims, including that he had lost Michigan because of fraud or misconduct in Wayne County, where Detroit is located. P37, who is Mike Shirkey, who is the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, corrected Donald Trump and told him that he had lost primarily because in 2 routinely Republican counties, the defendant had underperformed with educated females. And if he had received the same number of votes there as the 2 winning local sheriffs, he likely would have won Michigan. This is incredibly important, right? So Donald Trump is on the phone with Republican leaders in Michigan, and he's like, I won, and the fraud was actually in Wayne County, which is Detroit, which is a heavily urban area, which has a lot of folks of color in the voting pool, right? And we've heard Donald Trump point to cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta. Thank you, grab him for the roses. Thank you. We've heard him talk about those places as the spots where fraud was happening, really as a way to bring doubt on votes of people of color in urban areas. But notice here, right, that the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, a Republican, is breaking down these numbers for him, right? And he's like, actually, no, you were actually doing pretty good in Wayne County. What happened is in counties that usually go Republican, you lost the educated female vote. Educated women were just like, no, you're not getting my vote. And they noted this because there were 2 local sheriffs in that area who did win, who were Republicans and got those women's votes and did win. And if Donald Trump had just performed better with that group, he would have won, right? So they're actually pointing him to where he lost the numbers and what happened there. All right, we're at the top of page 33. So P37, again, Mike Shirkey, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, could tell by Trump's body language that he was not happy to hear his assessment. Notably, Trump only raised fraud claims to the extent that they affected the outcome of his own race, not those for other offices in Michigan. Again, this is incredibly important, right? So how are you in here saying that, oh, there was so much election fraud, but it didn't affect any other races? All the other races are legitimate. Just yours is a fraud, right? It doesn't make any sense, which is basically what they're saying. All right, middle of page 33. Co-conspirator number 1, Rudy Giuliani's participation came after the legislatures assured Donald Trump that they were looking into fraud claims. Trump dialed Rudy Giuliani into the meeting and said, quote, Rudy, tell them what's going on, unquote. Rudy then launched into a fraud monologue. Finally, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader interrupted and asked, quote, so when are you going to file a lawsuit in Michigan, unquote? A question that Rudy Giuliani ignored and did not answer, right? Notice that push from the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, who's essentially like, you're making all these claims. If you believe it's real, when are you going to file a case? When are you going to do that? Thank you so much for the gift. When is that something that you're going to do, right? Put up or shut up if this is what you believe. Immediately after the meeting, P37, Mike Shirkey, and P38, Lee Chatfield, so again, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader and the Michigan House Speaker, released a public statement in which they stated that they had, quote, not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan. On November 21st, the defendant acknowledged that those 2 statements when he tweeted, quote, this is true, but much different than reported by the media, and implicitly conceded that he had not provided evidence of fraud yet when he added, quote, we will show massive and unprecedented fraud, end quote. Days later, the defendant's campaign declined to request a statewide recount in Michigan, for which it would have had to pay unless the recount succeeded in changing the outcome of the election. So to summarize that last little bit, right, essentially what's happening is Donald Trump tries to get these people on the phone with Rudy Giuliani, tries to pressure them into saying that there was fraud, right? They're like, do you have any evidence of this? And they're like, no, not so much. So then those two Republican officials get on the internet and they're like, hey, we haven't seen any evidence of fraud. Nothing untoward is going on. Donald Trump gets on the internet and is like, yeah, sure. Oh, thank you so much for that. He's like, we are going to show massive and unprecedented fraud, but then actually never does. They have an opportunity to file litigation if that's what they believe. They also have an opportunity to request a statewide recount in Michigan, but do not. Primarily because if they call for that, they're going to have to pay for it unless the results overturn the previous example. The previous results. All right, we're at the top of page 34. So despite failing to establish any valid fraud claims, Rudy Giuliani followed up with Mike Shirkey and Lee Chatfield, those Michigan officials, and attempted to pressure them to use the Michigan legislature to overturn the valid election results. On December 4th, Rudy Giuliani sent a message to P38, again Lee Chatfield, claiming that Georgia was poised to do so based on Rudy Giuliani's and John Eastman's false advocacy there in the December 3rd hearing. Remember, last night we went over that section of the motion where they had that hearing in Georgia where they were showing those videotapes of State Farm where the folks were actually counting the ballots, where you had the two black women that Rudy Giuliani accused of lying. They then sued him for libel, for defamation. He was found liable of that, now owes them millions of dollars, on the verge of bankruptcy. So that's what they're referencing here. So again, on December 4th, Rudy sends a message to P38, again Lee Chatfield, claiming that Georgia is also poised to use the legislature to overturn the valid election results, right? And then asked him for help. He says, quote, looks like Georgia may well hold some factual hearings and change the certification under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. As John Eastman explained, they don't just have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan, end quote. That's what Rudy was saying. On December 7th, Rudy Giuliani attempted to send P37, who is Mike Shirkey, again, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, a message, though it failed because he typed the wrong number into his phone. But the message says, quote, so I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that states, the election is in dispute. There's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, and the electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not the official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadline of December 8th under Michigan law. Now, I'm going to pause here and explain what this means, right? So yesterday we talked about what the fake elector scheme is, right? So the way that the Electoral College works is that each state has to elect a certain amount of people who will serve as electors based on who wins. So the Democrats get a slate of electors for their presidential candidate, and the Republicans get a slate of electors for their candidate. And then whoever wins the popular vote of that state, or in a couple states like Nebraska or Maine, they'll divvy it up via congressional districts. But whoever wins the popular vote there, it is their slate of electors that is then certified and then sent to Congress to be counted. And so essentially what Rudy Giuliani and Trump are trying to do is get these state legislatures to throw out the electors for Joe Biden and input the ones for Trump in their place, right? That's what they're trying to do. And so in this message, Rudy Giuliani is literally trying to text the Michigan Senate Majority Leader to say, I need you to go out there and tell people that the election is in dispute. that there's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, which there was not at the time, and that the electors sent, Joe Biden's electors that were sent by Governor Whitmer, are not the official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the deadline, right? That's what he's attempting to do. Campaign operative P5, who is Michael Roman, was involved in the drafting of this message with the assistance of P41, who is Scott Gregson, who was associated with the defendant's campaign efforts in Michigan. The following day, Rudy shared the draft with Donald Trump, sending it to his executive assistant, P42, who is Molly Michael, by email, right? So this is important, because Jack Smith is showing us specifically, right, that all of this information was going to Trump. He's tracking this process, right? So this isn't something that people are doing without his knowledge, right? And remember, it's important for us to recall what we discussed yesterday about how in the beginning, Donald Trump had a legal team of like legitimate lawyers. And then they got to a place where they were like, actually, we just need to concede this litigation. We've clearly lost in Arizona and we've lost the election. At that point, Donald Trump fired most of those people and put Rudy Giuliani in charge and said everybody's going to answer to him. And in this document, they have quotes by Steve Bannon saying everybody needs to now answer to Rudy Giuliani because that's the only way that we're going to win this thing, and Trump is in this to win it, right? So basically saying all of the lawyers with any scruples who are going to follow the ethics code, we're kicking them out. We're putting Rudy Giuliani in charge to move forward with this. All right. Okay, so now we are at the top of page 35. Again, if you're just joining us, you can find this document. You can download it from my page. The link is right there. And we're on page 35. This is the unsealed presidential immunity motion that Jack Smith, the special counsel from the Department of Justice, had to file with Judge Chutkan under the direction of the Supreme Court. That was like, you need to prove that the evidence that you're trying to bring is not excluded or that it's not allowed because of presidential immunity. All right, we're at the top of page 35. These efforts failed. The efforts to get the Michigan Senate Majority Leader to make false claims about the election failed. On December 14th, the day that duly appointed electors across the country met and cast their electoral votes, P37, Mike Shirkey, the Senate Majority Leader in Michigan, and P38, Lee Chatfield, the Michigan House Speaker, issued public statements confirming that Donald Trump had lost Michigan and the legislature still had not received evidence of outcome determinative fraud in their state. P37, Mike Shirkey, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, his public statement included this quote, "We have not received evidence of fraud on a scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan." P38, Lee Chatfield, the Michigan House Speaker, stated in part, now I'm going to read you this block quote that you can see on the screen. "We've diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. I think he's done an incredible job, but I love our republic too. I can't fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump, simply because some think that there may have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason, and that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new slate of electors. I fear we lose our country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College, and I can't stand for that. I won't." That is a quote from Lee Chatfield, who was the Michigan House Speaker, a Republican who said specifically that he wanted Donald Trump to win. But what Donald Trump was asking them to do was illegal, that it was unprecedented, and that he said, quote, "I fear we lose our country forever." Okay, this is why this is so important. This is why this is so damning. Okay, and is it Made Nuts too? That's an interesting name. To say your vote doesn't count, that's exactly what Trump was trying to do with this attempt to overcome the election. But we can see how voting for these officials, even though they were Republican, voting for people who are going to uphold the rule of law and the Constitution literally saved our republic in this moment, okay? Because our constitutional republic is essentially a handshake, right? It's a gentleman and a lady's agreement that we are going to abide by the Constitution, even when the results are something that we don't like. Okay. And that is what these individuals did under pressure from the sitting president of the United States to overturn an election. They said, no, that's not what our republic is about. That's not what our country is about. And I encourage all of you to do the same at the ballot box in November. All right, let's continue. We're at the bottom of page 35. On January 3rd, Trump's campaign publicly posted P37 Mike Shirkey's, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader's phone number, posted his phone number, and attempted to post Lee Chatfield's, the Michigan House Speaker's phone number, but erred by one digit, in a tweet urging, quote, contact Speaker and Senate Majority Leader, end quote. They received 4,000 text messages in 2 hours, forcing them to get a new number. Right? So this is showing you that pressure, that bullying that's going on in this attempt to overturn the election. All right. So that's what happened in Michigan. So our summary there is essentially that Rudy Giuliani and Trump tried to call the Michigan Senate Majority Leader, the Michigan House Speaker, made random claims of fraud. Those folks were like, we did an investigation. None of the things that you're saying are true. Do you have any evidence? And they were like, yeah, we'll send it to you. Never did, but then got on Twitter and kept making claims that there had been fraud, right? To the point where these two gentlemen had to get up and issue statements saying, no, there was no fraud. They are asking us to overturn this free and fair election to replace Joe Biden's electors with Trump's, and that is a danger to our republic, and I won't do it. And in response to that, Trump's campaign essentially doxes these individuals, puts their phone number on the internet, and opens them up to ridicule and harm. All right, so that's Michigan. We're at the bottom of page 35, and now we're going to get into Nevada. So far, we've heard about Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan. Nevada. On November 17th, in Law versus Whitmer, which is the name of a court case, agents of Donald Trump in Nevada filed suit claiming, quote, substantial irregularities, improprieties, and fraud in the presidential election, including based on machines used in ballot signature matching and votes by non-resident and unalived voters. Donald Trump approved a press conference by his surrogates announcing the suit. All right, so now we're at the top of page 36. On November 19th, P43 Justin Reamer, who is the Republican National Committee's chief counsel, so their head lawyer in charge, sent an email to P44, who is Sophia Lay, or LAI, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, who's a Republican National Committee spokesperson. Hold on, I forgot to tell my assistant we're not meeting today. Let me let her know that. Okay. So on November 19th, the RNC chief counsel sent an email to an RNC spokesperson warning about inaccuracies in the suit. Quote, just FYI that I don't believe the claims in the contest regarding unalived voters, those voting from out of state, etc., are substantiated. We are working with the campaign on a data matching project, and those numbers are going to be a lot lower than what the Nevada people have come up with. They are also targeting our military voters. To be frank, the contest has little chance of succeeding. Happy to discuss this stuff if you want more. This is like a smoking pew-pew, okay? Because you've got the Republican National Committee's chief lawyer reaching out to sending an email, okay, to a spokesperson for the RNC and saying specifically these claims that they're putting out about unalived voters, people voting from out of state, these are unsubstantiated. There's no evidence for this. It's like we are trying to work with the campaign on like a data matching project to like be able to say these are the numbers that we think we have, but those numbers are going to be like real low. Like it's not going to be outcome determinative. And he also says they are targeting our military voters, so folks overseas who are sending their ballots in. He says, to be frank, the contest has little chance of succeeding. So this court case has little chance of succeeding, right? So we already know that people in charge of the Republican Party, the chief lawyer of that party, is like, this isn't real, okay? Then we have that spokesperson, Sophia, sends a copy of, what was his name again? P43. Justin Reimers, the chief lawyer for the RNC, sends out a copy of his email from her personal email account to the personal account of P45, who is Dan Scavino, one of Donald Trump's White House staffers who also volunteered for the campaign. Notwithstanding the RNC chief counsel's warning, Donald Trump retweeted and amplified news of the lawsuit on November 24th, calling it, quote, big news, unquote, that a Nevada court had agreed to hear it. But Donald Trump did not similarly promote the fact that within 2 weeks, on December 4th, the Nevada District Court dismissed that lawsuit called Law v. Whitmer, finding in a detailed opinion that, quote, there is no credible or reliable evidence that the 2020 general election in Nevada was affected by fraud, end quote, including through the signature match machines, and that Biden won the election in the state. 4 days later, on December 8th, Nevada's Supreme Court unanimously affirmed that district court's decision, noting that despite its, quote, earlier order asking appellants to identify specific findings with which they take issue, appellants have not pointed to any unsupported factual findings, and we have identified none. Later in his ellipse speech, that speech on January 6th out there at the mall on January 6th, Donald Trump repeated multiple claims explicitly rejected by Nevada courts. Now, it's important for us to go over this because I'm sure, right, like the term appellant and that kind of thing is difficult to understand. But basically, Donald Trump put forward this suit, right, that the chief lawyer of the Republican National Committee was like, these claims are garbage, right? But the Nevada court agrees to hear it. But then just 2 weeks after they agree to hear it, they dismiss it. They put it out of the court, right? And they give you a detailed opinion, and they say there is no credible or reliable evidence that the general election in Nevada was affected by fraud. There is no proof of this, okay? Now, the Trump campaign appeals that. They then become the appellants, right? They appeal that ruling. They send it up to a higher court. And that higher court is the Nevada Supreme Court, right? Because each state has their own Supreme Court. And that Nevada Supreme Court unanimously, every member on that court says, no, the lower court got it right. There is no evidence here. And they say that they asked the appellants, they asked Donald Trump and his campaign to identify specific findings that they take issue with, specific things that they say are false, and that Donald Trump and his team have not pointed to any evidence, any unsupported factual findings, and we also, as the court, have not identified any, right? And despite that, despite the fact that the Republican National Committee's lead lawyer, despite the fact that the District Court of Nevada, despite the fact that the Supreme Court of Nevada all investigated this and said there's no evidence of this, in his speech at Ellipse on January 6th, Donald Trump got up there and repeated the claims that were specifically rejected by these courts. That the RNC chief counsel knew was fake all along. He sent that message to an RNC spokesperson, and that person sent that email to someone working directly in the White House for Trump's campaign. All right, we're now near the middle of page 37. On December 18th, the Nevada Secretary of State's office released a, quote, facts versus myths document to combat disinformation that Trump and others were propagating about the election, including false claims that the Secretary of State's office had not investigated claims of fraud, even though it had, quote, been presented with evidence of widespread fraud, unquote, to which the office responded, quote, while we are pursuing action in a number of isolated cases, we have yet to see any evidence of widespread fraud, end quote. The Facts versus Myths document also stated publicly that courts had universally rejected fraud claims. Quote, 4 separate cases were heard by Nevada judges, including the Nevada Supreme Court. After examining records presented, each case was discounted due to a lack of evidence, right? So you've got the Nevada Secretary of State's office, who are in charge of running elections, releasing a statement, putting out something on facts versus myth, trying to get people to understand that 4 courts have investigated this and there's been no evidence of fraud found. Okay. So that wraps up Nevada, where they essentially attempted to go through the court system, and the courts were like, we investigated this, you don't have any evidence, right? And the way the courts work is you've got to bring some evidence to back up your claims. You can't just get up and say random stuff, right? Like, you got to have evidence in a court of law. Otherwise, they'll throw out your claims, okay? Yes, Clark, it's literally 2024, and it's a shame that we are still having to deal with this, right? That the Supreme Court came out with the bogus immunity ruling, and that Trump's team has been trying to delay this trial, that the Republicans in Congress, when they had the chance, okay, in January and February of 2020, to at least pass a bill essentially saying that Donald Trump is not allowed to run for office again because the Constitution literally says insurrectionists shouldn't be able to do that. And they didn't. They chose not to. And that's how we've gotten here. Okay? That's how we've gotten here. Thank you for the gifts, Guy. All right. We are at the bottom of page 37. And now we're going to get into what happened in Pennsylvania. 2 days after the election, on November 6th, Donald Trump called P46, who is Bernie Kerik, which is Pennsylvania's Republican Party chair, okay? Which is the entity responsible for supporting Republican candidates in the Commonwealth at the federal, state, and local level. P46, who is Bernie, we'll just call him Bernie, had a prior relationship with Donald Trump, including having represented him in litigation in Pennsylvania after the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump asked Bernie how, without fraud, he had gone from winning Pennsylvania on Election Day to trailing in the days afterwards. Now remember, back at the very beginning of this document, they spoke about how Donald Trump had talked about what his strategy would be before the election even happened, because the people on his team told him, because of the way that mail-in balloting works and how they are going to count those after they count the live votes on Election Day, it's going to look like on Election Day you're going to get some returns and it's going to look like you're ahead. But as those votes from mail-in ballots start coming in, Biden is going to start gaining on you, right? And he's likely to overtake you. So the strategy is, we're just going to say on Election Day, you're just going to go out there and declare victory. That was his strategy. That's what he did in that 2020 AM speech on the night of the election. So now we've got Donald Trump on the phone with the Republican Party chairperson in Pennsylvania, asking him how, without fraud, had he gone from winning Pennsylvania on Election Day, right, when those initial votes from the day of were coming in, to trailing in the days after. Consistent with what campaign staff already had told Donald Trump, Bernie confirmed that it was not fraud. It was that there were roughly 1,750,000 mail-in ballots still being counted in Pennsylvania, which were expected to be 80% for Biden. Over the following 2 months, Donald Trump spread false claims of fraud in Pennsylvania anyway, right? So he's called down there to the head of his own party in Pennsylvania, and he's asking what's going on with the numbers. And that guy tells him flat out, there is no fraud. What's happening is we are counting legal mail-in ballots. And it was the middle of a pandemic, and most of the Democrats had put in their ballots via mail, and there's nearly 2 million ballots coming in that are likely for Biden, at least by 80%. And that's why you are now trailing and likely to lose Pennsylvania. But he lied anyway. Middle of page 38. In early November, in a campaign meeting, when the defendant suggested that more people in Pennsylvania voted than had checked in to vote, Deputy Campaign Manager P3, who is Justin Clark, corrected him. His own Deputy Campaign Manager corrects him on this statement. Around the same time, Philadelphia City Commissioner P47, who is Al Schmidt, appeared on television and stated that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in in Philadelphia. After seeing the interview, Donald Trump targeted P47, Al Schmidt, in a tweet, saying, quote, A guy named Pete Schmidt, or Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican, parentheses, Rhino, Republican in name only, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. We win! Exclamation point. End quote. As a result of Donald Trump's attacks, threats that Al already was receiving became more targeted and detailed, and included his address and the names of his family members. Note, this is the section of the motion where Jack Smith is outlining the evidence that Donald Trump knew he was lying when he said these things, right? So that's why it's important that he's making these claims and we have evidence footnoted here, which lets you know that Jack plans to bring like some sort of hard evidence, like an exhibit, like a text message, an email, contemporaneous notes taken during a meeting, those types of things. Where he's making these false claims, his deputy campaign manager tells him, actually, no, there's no evidence of that. And you've got the Philadelphia city commissioner on television saying, we've done our investigation, there's no widespread fraud. And what does Trump do? He doxes him, basically, gets on Twitter, makes claims about him, and then this man's address and names of his family members are out there, and people are sending those to him in threats. We're at the top of page 39 now. Yeah, I see you. I can't wait for this to go to trial either. And it's important to note that the only way that this goes forward is if he doesn't win this election in November. Because if Donald Trump becomes president, he'll be in control, essentially, of the DOJ again, which is what Project 2025 calls for. It also calls for giving the president more control over state elections. Which is just wild and unprecedented. So he would be able to just make this case go away, which I think, in my estimation, is one of the reasons why he's running and needs to win so bad. All right, we're at the top of page 39. On Donald Trump's behalf, Rudy Giuliani, too, spread patently false claims about Pennsylvania. On November 25th, Rudy Giuliani and P12, who is Jenna Ellis, who's one of Trump's lawyers, attended an unofficial hearing with Republican state legislatures in a Gettysburg hotel conference room. Donald Trump called in, claimed to have been watching, and demanded that the election in Pennsylvania, quote, has to be turned around, unquote. You've got the sitting president of the United States of America talking to Republican state legislatures in Pennsylvania, telling them they need to turn this election around. During the event, Rudy Giuliani falsely stated that Pennsylvania issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. The claim was rooted in an obvious error. The comparison of the number of ballots sent out in the primary election to the number of ballots received in the general election. To be clear there, right? The primary election is when like people are just voting to nominate the different candidates for president as either Republican or Democrat, right? So when everybody went to the polls like back in January and last December to do those primary votes, that's what they were comparing to the ballots that were actually sent out for election day. So an obvious error. After seeing Rudy Giuliani make this claim, P43, who is Justin Reamer, again, the RNC's chief counsel, remember that head lawyer for the Republican Party, he tweets publicly, quote, "This is not true," end quote. In the following days, campaign staff internally confirmed that Rudy Giuliani was lying. When one campaign staffer wrote in an email that Rudy Giuliani's claim was, quote, just wrong, and, quote, there's no way to defend it, end quote, P3, who is Justin Clark, the deputy campaign manager, responded, quote, "We have been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating," end quote. Likewise, in late November or December, P9, Greg Jacobs, who was a White House lawyer, informed Donald Trump directly that the claim that Rudy Giuliani was spreading, that, quote, Pennsylvania received 700,000 more mail-in ballots than were mailed out, unquote, was, quote, bullshit, and explained the error. Okay? This is some just incredible new evidence here, right? You've got emails and text messages and tweets from leaders of the Republican Party, from members of Donald Trump's campaign staff, and evidence now that a member of his campaign staff looked Donald Trump in the face and told him that the claim that Rudy Giuliani was making about the ballots in Pennsylvania was, quote, bullshit, and explained the error that they made, right? There is no reason for this man, Donald Trump, to not know that these are lies, okay? And the way, some good evidence to know that this is true, as you can see some of these MAGA trolls in the comments being like, oh, there's no new evidence. Oh, this isn't true. And it's like, honey, please, the document's on the internet. You can download it from my page. It's right there, and we are on page 39. It's also important to know another reason why we know that this is new evidence. So Congress had their January 6th hearing, but Mike Pence did not come to testify because he claimed executive privilege and they can't actually make him do it. But what's going on here is a prosecutor, the DOJ, has much more leeway to get information than Congress does because they can do discovery, they can do depositions, and all of the evidence that we are seeing laid out here are all from Republican officials. There's not a single Democrat in here. They are all Republican officials, people working on his own campaign, documents from his own campaign. We're at the bottom of page 39 of this document. P43, Justin Raymer, the RNC chief counsel, followed up on his public tweet in a private email on November 28th to P44, who's Sophia Lay, remember that RNC spokesperson again, expressing his concerns about Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis's spread of disinformation. Quote, he says, I'm really not trying to give you a hard time, but what Rudy and Jenna are doing is a joke, and they are getting laughed out of court. It's setting us back in our fight for election integrity, and they are misleading millions of people who have wishful thinking that the president is going to somehow win this thing. End quote. We've got to read that again, okay? This is an email directly from the chief lawyer in charge of the Republican National Committee of the entire Republican Party saying, I'm really not trying to give you a hard time, but what Rudy Giuliani and this other Trump lawyer, Jenna Ellis, are doing is a joke, and they are getting laughed out of court. It's setting us back in our fight for election integrity, and they are misleading millions of people who have wishful thinking that the president is going to somehow win this thing. When Rudy Giuliani learned of the RNC chief counsel's tweet and that email that we just read on November 28th, Rudy Giuliani called the head lawyer of the RNC and left a threatening voicemail stating, quote, I really do need an explanation for what you said today, because if there isn't a good one, you should resign. Got it? So call me or I'll call the boss and get you to resign. Call me. It'd be better for you if you do. Rudy Giuliani also contacted the RNC chairwoman, P39, who is Ronna McDonald, to demand that the chief counsel of the RNC be fired. And thereafter, the chief counsel of the RNC was relieved of his duties as the RNC chief counsel. What Jack Smith has just laid out here is you've got the head lawyer of the Republican Party, right, emailing and being very explicit. What Rudy and this other lawyer are doing is a joke. There is no evidence for this. They are harming the process. Rudy sees this and his tweet where the chief counsel was like, none of this is true, calls him, threatens him, and it's like, you better stop this or you should resign. Call me right now. And when he doesn't get that call back, he calls the RNC chairwoman, so the person in charge of the RNC, and gets that man fired for telling the truth about the election. That's what Jack Smith is alleging. That's what the evidence points to. Now, we are in the last paragraph of page 40. On December 3rd, 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislature issued a public letter stating that the General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state election code and the Constitution. P48, Michael Caldry, who is a guy online, I guess, an agent of Trump who worked closely with Rudy Giuliani, issued a tweet showing the 4 legislatures' names and signatures and wrote, quote, "These are the 4 cowardice Pennsylvania legislators that intend to allow the Democratic machine to hashtag steal the vote. Hashtag cowards, hashtag liars, hashtag traitors," end quote, while linking to the legislators' Twitter accounts. On Sunday, December 6th, at 12:56 a.m. from the White House residence, having returned from a political rally in Valdosta, Georgia, Donald Trump retweeted and amplified those posts. So you've got 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislature putting out a public letter, right, saying we actually just don't have the authority to overturn the popular vote and put in this false slate of electors like Trump wants us to, because that would actually violate the election code and the Constitution of the United States. In response to that, okay, what's his name? P48, Michael Caldry, who is an online figure, gets on Twitter, says that these people are trying to steal the vote, and Donald Trump retweets them. So that is Pennsylvania, right? Where you've got the RNC chief counsel saying these are lies. You've got members of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania saying these are lies. There is no fraud, right? And you've seen a pattern of Rudy Giuliani calling in and pressuring people and then getting them fired, right? That's what's going on. Now we're at the top of page 41 and we're going to get into Wisconsin. All right. On November 29th, a recount that Donald Trump's campaign had petitioned and paid for confirmed that Biden had won in Wisconsin and increased Trump's margin of defeat. Okay, so they had paid for a recount in Wisconsin. The recount confirmed that Biden had won, and by even more than they originally thought. Okay. On December 14th, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected Donald Trump's campaign's election lawsuit there. As a result, on December 21st, Wisconsin's governor signed a certificate of final determination, confirming the prior certificate of ascertainment that established Biden's electors as the valid electors of the state, right? So this is just a little bit about the process. So when you've got your slate of electors, there's a certificate of ascertainment that comes out of the legislature, and they're like, okay, these are the electors who are going to go forward because their candidate won the popular vote. And then you have the governor come through and sign a final certificate, right, that says, yes, I'm just going to confirm these folks. This is the list that's going to go to Congress. All right. In response to all of this, in response to the governor certifying the election, Donald Trump issued a series of tweets attacking P49, who is Brian Hagedorn, who is the Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice, okay, who had written the majority opinion that rejected Donald Trump's campaign lawsuit and advocating that the Wisconsin legislature overturn the valid election results, right? So basically Trump gets bad news. The Wisconsin Supreme Court comes through. They're like, there is no fraud. We're certifying this election. We're moving forward. Donald Trump gets upset. He says this, quote, 2 years ago, can y'all see that? It's the big block quote down at the bottom. 2 years ago, the great people of Wisconsin asked me to endorse a man named Brian Hagedorn for the state Supreme Court justice when he was getting destroyed in the polls against a tough Democrat candidate who had no chance of losing. After my endorsement, Brian easily won. Wow, in all caps. He just voted against me in a big court decision on voter fraud, parentheses, of which there was much, exclamation point. Despite many pages of dissent from 3 highly respected justices. One thing has nothing to do with another, but we ended up losing 4-3 in a really incorrect ruling. Great Republicans in Wisconsin should take these 3 strong decisions to their state legislatures and overturn this ridiculous state election. We won in a landslide, in all caps. So this is Donald Trump on Twitter, basically trying to be like, the people of Wisconsin and the people in the Wisconsin state legislature should use the dissenting opinions in the Supreme Court, in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, to try and overturn this election. All right, we're at the bottom of page 41. After Donald Trump's tweet, the state marshals responsible for Brian Hagedorn's safety arranged to provide Brian with additional police protection based on social media traffic and other threatening communications. Again, this is a pattern of the things Trump gets on Twitter and says, creating threats of harm against people. All right. Now, that's the end of his state-by-state account. So we heard about Arizona, we heard about Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Nevada. And now we're about to get into section 7 at the top of page 42. Thanks, Sandy San. About the voting machines in multiple states. Now, previously, the organization had the document. The organization of the document has been that Jack has been going state by state, but now we're about to get into one umbrella situation where we're talking about voting machines in multiple states. All right. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant and co-conspirators repeatedly made claims about the security and accuracy of voting machines across multiple states, despite the fact that they were on notice that these claims were false. As early as November 12th, for instance, the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, and other coordinated federal, state, and private entities issued a public statement declaring that the 2020 election was, quote, the most secure in American history, end quote, and that there was quote, no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. You've got officials, okay? The National Association of Secretaries of State, basically every Secretary of State in the country. The National Association of State Election Directors. Oh, thank you so much for the gift. The National Association of State Election Directors. So basically every state election director in the country, right? Putting out a statement saying there was no fraud and that this was, quote, the most secure in American history in terms of elections. Thank you, Mama. And that there was no evidence that any voting system, any voting machine deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was any way compromised. This happens on November 12th, literally 6 days after the election. Then, on November 14th, in the tweet announcing that Rudy Giuliani was to lead his campaign legal efforts, Donald Trump also named CC3 Sidney Powell, a private attorney who was fixated on voting machine claims, and P10 Joseph DeGenova, another private attorney. 2 days later, on November 16th, on Donald Trump's behalf, his executive assistant, P42, which is Molly Michael, and co-conspirator 3, Sidney Powell, and other private attorneys send an email titled, quote, from POTUS. And POTUS is an acronym for President of the United States. Attaching a document containing bullet points critical of Dominion, which is C3. And Dominion is the company that had the voting machine. Document containing bullet points critical of Dominion, which is C3. And Dominion is the company that had the voting machines. All right. So the email says they attach a document containing bullet points critical of Dominion, a company that manufactured voting machines used in certain states, and writing, quote, see attached. Please include as is or almost as is in lawsuit, end quote. Co-conspirator number 3, Sidney Powell, responded 9 minutes later, writing, quote, and this is in all caps, it must go in all suits in Georgia and Pennsylvania immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire election to be set aside in those states and machines impounded for nonpartisan professional inspection, right? So literally 3 days or 4 days after basically every Secretary of State and every state election director was like, there has been no problem with any of the voting machines and the election is secure. Donald Trump's attorneys are sending private emails with attachments with bullet points of baseless statements against Dominion, and their lawyer, Sidney Powell, is like, you got to put this in all the suits that we're filing in Georgia and Pennsylvania with this fraud claim, telling them to set the election aside. Now we're at the bottom of page 42. On November 17th, P50, who is Chris Krebs, the director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, called CISA, publicly tweeted that a group of private election security experts concluded that claims of computer-based fraud, quote, either have been unsubstantiated or are technically incoherent. Okay, you've got the director. So the person in charge of, thank you so much, Amy, the person in charge of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, okay? It doesn't get any higher than this in terms of folks who are able to tell you whether or not some weird shit went down with a voting machine, okay? It doesn't get any more legit than this. He puts out a tweet saying that a group of private election security experts in the field on this, okay, they concluded that these claims about these Dominion machines, quote, either have been unsubstantiated, proven untrue, or are technically incoherent, which is a, thank you, Lady J, which is a legal way of saying stupid, okay? It is technically incoherent. You're not making any sense, right? Like, it's not within the realm of reality. Thank you so much, Layla. All right. 2 days later, on November 19th, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and then P10, who is Joseph DeGenova, so all of the lawyers, and others hold a press conference at the Republican National Committee headquarters on behalf of Donald Trump and his campaign. During it, Sidney Powell made false and factually impossible claims regarding Dominion and the integrity of the country's election infrastructure. Jack Smith is so kind, because to say factually impossible claims is just like stupid. It's the same thing as technically incoherent. It's a kind legal way of saying you're out of your mind. Okay? It's completely impossible. That night, Fox News television personality P51, Tucker Carlson, stated on air that because of because of co-conspirator 3, Sidney Powell's incendiary comments about voting machines, he had invited her on his television program. So Tucker Carlson, my God, invites Sidney on his program. He further stated, quote, but she never sent us any evidence, despite a lot of requests, polite requests, not a page. When we kept pressing, she got angry and told us to stop contacting her. When we checked with others around the Trump campaign, people in positions of authority, they told us that Sidney has never given them any evidence either. She never demonstrated that a single actual vote was moved illegitimately by software from one candidate to another. Not one. And I want to hear MAGA's response to this. Tucker Carlson, your golden boy, okay, on Fox News, telling you he invited Sidney Powell, the one making these claims about Dominion, onto his site because she was making these claims. But she never sent any evidence, despite them sending polite requests a lot. In fact, they said after they continued to press her, she got angry and told them to stop contacting her for evidence of the things that she was saying about our elections. Tucker says they checked with the rest of the Trump campaign and people in positions of authority, and they told Tucker, we never got any evidence from her either. She never demonstrated that a single actual vote was moved illegitimately. Thank you, yikes thump. That a single actual vote was moved illegitimately from, actually, it's asking me to confirm. Give me just a second. There we go. She never is able to demonstrate that a single actual vote was moved illegitimately by software, by these voting machines from one candidate to another. Not one. That's Tucker Carlson telling you that. All right. Bottom of page 43. Let me make sure I'm keeping up here so you can see where I am at. Again, if you're just joining us and you want to read along, you can download this document from my page. The link is right there. And this is the document that Judge Chutkan released in former President Trump's immunity trial, his trial about trying to overturn the 2020 election. This is the motion from Jack Smith, a special prosecutor for the Department of Justice, who is doing what the Supreme Court demanded that he do, which is show that he has evidence of these kinds of crimes that are not something that would be immune from prosecution. We're at the bottom of page 43. We're talking about the evidence against Donald Trump, that the claims that he was making that the Dominion voting machines were swapping votes were lies, and that he knew they were lies the entire time. All right. The defendant saw his private attorney's RNC press conference and P51 Tucker Carlson's discussion of Sydney. And Donald Trump acknowledged to Jason Miller that Sidney Powell, who's making all these ridiculous claims, appeared, quote, unhinged in the press conference. This is Trump himself saying Sydney is out of her mind. Okay. On November 20th, the day after the press conference, Donald Trump made a similar comment to P7 Mark Meadows and P45 Dan Scavino, two White House staffers who also volunteered for his campaign. In casual conversation after another meeting had ended, Donald Trump told P7 Mark Meadows and P45 Dan Scavino and P51 Tucker Carlson had, quote, eviscerated or destroyed Sydney. Okay. The defendant, Donald Trump, then had a call with Sydney on speakerphone while Mark Meadows and Dan Scavino listened in and mentioned the Tucker Carlson segment to Sydney. Okay. While Sydney responded, Donald Trump placed the call on mute and had Mark Meadows and Dan Scavino mocked and laughed at her. They were mocking and laughing at Sydney, calling her claims crazy, and made a reference to the science fiction series Star Trek when describing her allegations. In the same time period, when P9, who is Greg Jacobs-White, remember our White House lawyers, thank you so much, Kathleen, from the beginning, right? Greg is the only one who's telling them all these claims you're making are not going to hold up in court. You really got to stop this, okay? Greg is in there. So in the same time period, when Greg is telling Donald Trump that Sydney's claims were unreliable and should not be included in lawsuits, Donald Trump agreed that he had not seen anything to support Sydney's allegations. Now, this is incredible, right? Because Donald Trump's whole defense is that, like, no, there was actually fraud, right? That was actually happening. But we've got evidence, footnoted evidence, people in his campaign, people on his team willing to testify, showing evidence that when Sydney got on television and was making all these weird claims about Dominion and how votes were being switched in the machines, she couldn't send no evidence to Tucker Carlson. Donald Trump saw Tucker Carlson straight up, quote, eviscerate and destroy her, which is how Trump described it. They got her on the phone, on speakerphone, and were making fun of her and her claims. That shows you he knows these are lies. He knows these claims about the Dominion voting machines are untrue. Okay? Then, middle of page 44. On November 22, thanks so much, Melanie. On November 22nd, notwithstanding Donald Trump's tweet from 8 days prior announcing Sidney Powell's involvement, Rudy Giuliani issued a statement on behalf of the Trump campaign distancing Donald Trump from Sydney. Okay? Quote, Sydney is practicing law on her own. She is not a member of the Trump legal team. She is also not a lawyer for the president in his personal capacity. End quote. Nonetheless, Donald Trump continued to support and publicize, thanks James, Sydney's knowingly false claims. For example, within days of Rudy Giuliani's statement, the defendant promoted a lawsuit that Sydney was about to file, tweeting on November 24th, quote, breaking news in all caps. Sydney says her lawsuit in Georgia could be filed as soon as tomorrow, and says there's no way there was anything but widespread election fraud. Hashtag MAGA, hashtag America first, hashtag Dobbs. Now, side note, I don't know why he would hashtag Dobbs here. It seems like he's talking about Dobbs, the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, which is like not at all relevant here, but okay. So Sidney then filed a lawsuit the next day against the governor of Georgia, falsely alleging, quote, massive election fraud accomplished through Dominion's election software and hardware. Donald Trump again promoted the lawsuit in a tweet. The lawsuit was dismissed within 2 weeks on December 7th. So what Jack has just outlined here is Trump with his boys and, on a speakerphone call with her on mute saying, basically, this woman is crazy. None of these claims are real, right? Tucker destroyed her. She's never showed any evidence. But then as soon as and then also Rudy Giuliani being like, oh, we don't know her. We don't know her, right? But then once she's going to file this case based on her false claims about Dominion, right? Now Donald Trump is retweeting her, right? Thank you so much, Laughing, for the gift. All right. Now we're at the top of page 45. Again, you can download this and read along with me. It's linked on my page. All right. On November 29th, P50, Chris Krebs, remember the CISA director, right? The Cyber Security and Information group, right? The very top of folks who know about cybersecurity, okay? On November 29th, that guy, Chris, who was no longer the CISA director at the time, appeared on the television program 60 Minutes. Chris stated that he was confident that the election had been secure and, quote, that there was no manipulation of the vote on the machine count side, end quote. In response, Donald Trump tweeted publicly about Chris's appearance, quote, at 60 Minutes never asked us for a comment about the ridiculous one-sided story on election security, which is an international joke. Our 2020 election, from poorly rated Dominion to a country flooded with unaccounted for mail-in ballots, was probably our least secure ever, all caps, end quote. A few days later, P10, who is Joseph DeGenova, remember that lawyer, he appeared on a radio program as Trump's agent and said that because of Chris's, the former CISA director's, comments to promote confidence in the security of the election infrastructure, Chris, quote, should be drawn and quartered, taken out at dawn and pew-pewed. Literally, that's what he said. A lawyer for Trump, calling for violence against the former director of CISA because he dared to get on 60 Minutes and tell the truth that there's evidence that Trump knew at the time that the Dominion machines were secure, that there was no election fraud. It's absolutely out of control. We're at the bottom of page 45. Thereafter, because of what this lawyer said, okay, Chris received threats to be unalived, okay? He was subjected to unaliving threats. In a press conference on December 1st that Donald Trump acknowledged watching, P25, Gabriel Sterling, a Georgia election official, decried P10, right? What's his name? Joseph DeGenova, the one who just said those things about people needing to be drawn and quartered, right? He decried those statements and Donald Trump's public statement spreading disinformation and said that if they did not stop, quote, someone is going to get unalived, right? You have a Georgia election official calling for these people to stop telling these lies because people are going to be harmed. We are now at the top of page 46. Thank you so much, Ella. Thank you. All right, on December 1st, Attorney General P52 William Barr, y'all remember Bill Barr, stated publicly that the Justice Department had not seen evidence of fraud sufficient to change the election results. Thank you so much, Marty. I cannot stress this enough, right? That all the evidence that we're seeing, all the claims that there was no fraud, that the election was legitimate are coming from other Republicans, okay? Bill Barr, Attorney General, who I take issue with, has the sense of mind, the decency of mind to state that the Justice Department, in their investigations, have not seen any evidence of fraud sufficient to change the election results. Okay, thanks so much for the follow. All right, with respect to voting machines, Bill Barr said, quote, there's been one assertion that would be systemic fraud, and that would be the claim that machines were programmed essentially to skew the election results. And the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice have looked into that. And so far, we haven't seen anything to substantiate that. That's the kindest way that Bill Barr can say, we looked into it. Thanks so much, Pam and John. We looked into it. There's no evidence for this. There's no evidence for what you're talking about. Rudy Giuliani and P12, who is Jenna Ellis, remember Trump's one of Trump's lawyers, immediately issue a formal campaign statement attacking Bill Barr, the Attorney General that Donald Trump appointed, okay, and the Justice Department. And they write, quote, with all due respect to the Attorney General, there hasn't been any semblance of a Department of Justice investigation, ... His opinion appears to be without any knowledge or investigation of the substantial irregularities and evidence of systemic fraud. It's out of control. You've got the sitting Attorney General, DOJ, saying the Department of Homeland Security has investigated and we haven't found anything. And the very same people who keep saying these things without any evidence at all, Rudy Giuliani, and what the hell is her name? P12 again, getting on my nerves. Jenna Ellis, no evidence. And they get out and put out an official campaign statement, an official statement from the campaign, right? Dragging the Attorney General and the Department of Justice saying, y'all haven't done an investigation. The lies, it's like out of control. All right, middle of page 46. In mid-December, Donald Trump spoke with RNC chairwoman P39. We've heard from her earlier. Remember, Ronna McDaniel. Ronna McDaniel is the one that Rudy Giuliani called to get the head lawyer of the RNC fired when he started telling them there is no evidence for the things that you're claiming, right? So Donald Trump speaks with her again in mid-December and asked her to publicize and promote a private report that had been released on December 13th that purported to identify flaws in the use of Dominion's machines in Antrim County, Michigan. Ronna McDaniel refused, telling Donald Trump that she already had discussed the report with P38 Lee Chatfield. Remember him? He's the Michigan House Speaker, right? She says, I've already spoken with the Michigan Speaker of the House, who had told her that the report was inaccurate. Ronna then conveys to Donald Trump, right? The Michigan Speaker of the House's exact assessment was that the report was, quote, fucking nuts. That is a direct quote from page 46. The Michigan Speaker of the House said the claims that Donald Trump and his team were trying to make about the Dominion voting machines were fucking nuts. And he is being told this by the chair of the Republican National Committee, being told this over the phone directly, okay? Bottom of page 46. On January 2nd, during Donald Trump's call with Georgia's Secretary of State, P33, who is Brad Raffensperger, said of false claims regarding voting machines, quote, I don't believe that you're really questioning the Dominion machines because we did a hand retally, a 100% retally of all the ballots and compared them to what the machine said and came up with virtually the same result. Then we did the recount and we got virtually the same result. So I guess we can probably take that off the table. January 2nd, Donald Trump is on the phone with the Georgia Secretary of State, who is walking him through the facts, okay, about these voting machines. He's basically saying, I don't really believe that you can be questioning these votes. Thanks, Tammy. You can't be questioning these voting machines because we did a hand retally, a 100% retally of all the ballots, compared them to what the machine said, and virtually got the same result. Then we did another recount and got the same result again. They've counted these votes 3 times, and it is not different from what the voting machines are saying, right? And the Georgia Secretary of State is telling him you need to take that off the table. In response, Donald Trump falsely claimed that, quote, in other states, we think we found tremendous corruption with Dominion machines, but we'll have to see. Bald-faced lies, just open and out lies. Now we're on page 47, the first full paragraph there. At the ellipse on January 6th, right, where he's making his speech, Donald Trump and co-conspirators who spoke at the rally continued to make unsubstantiated and false claims about Dominion machines. Rudy Giuliani claimed that in the U.S. state runoff election in Georgia the day before, quote, the votes were deliberately changed by the same algorithm that was used in cheating President Trump and Vice President Pence, end quote. John Eastman continued the false attack. Quote, we now know because we caught it live last time in real time how the machines contributed to that fraud. They put those ballots in a secret folder in the machine, sitting there waiting until they know how many they need. And then the machine, after the close of the polls, we now know who's voted and we know who hasn't. And I can now, in that machine, match those unvoted ballots with an unvoted voter and put them together in the machine. ... We saw it happen in real time last night, and it happened on November 3rd as well, end quote. In his own speech, Donald Trump again raised the false specter of, quote, the highly troubling matter of Dominion's voting machines and lied about machines flipping votes from Donald Trump to Biden and an astronomical and astounding error rate in the machines ballot scanning. This is on January 6th. After all of them have been told multiple times that this is a lie, after they themselves have made fun of Sidney Powell, the lady who was making these claims in court that got thrown out after 2 weeks. They know these are lies. Donald Trump was on the phone, okay, with the Georgia Secretary of State being like, yo, we ran the hand count 3 times. It's the same as the machines. And then they get up on stage at the Ellipse on January 6th and lie again. All right, so that is the section on the voting machines. The next section is section D, that is entitled, the defendant organized and caused his electors to submit fraudulent certificates, creating the false appearance that states submitted competing electoral slates, right? And so this section is going to be about the attempt to get states to remove Joe Biden's duly elected electors to send to the Electoral College and have them counted by Congress, and instead put in a false slate of electors, the fake electors, right? But it is almost 4:30 where I'm at, and I have a shift to facilitate a phone bank for Kamala, because we still got to get out this vote. So I'm going to pause here. Are there any questions from folks that you'd like me to answer about what we've gone over so far? I can probably give you about 5 to 10 more minutes before I go do that phone bank. Chaz, thanks so much for the follow. Sheepdog, thank for the roses. I appreciate y'all so much. You should be back after 7. So my shift is about 2 hours. I'm going to go from 5 to 7 on that phone bank. Then I might eat. Thank you so much, Marty. And then I'll probably start back up around 7:30. So about 3 hours from now. Thank y'all so much for the follow. Definitely follow so you get that notification when I come back. But I'll be back at about 7:30, and we'll get into, oh, yay. Thank you so much for doing a phone bank yesterday. Yes. If y'all want to know how to do that, there's this, you can go to Mobilize, DOT, and it'll show you all of the events and things that you can get involved in nearby so that you can get involved in this election, because it is very clear we were already seeing the same patterns that Jack Smith has laid out here, right? It's already before the election. Trump is already casting doubt. You've got JD Vance on a debate stage saying, unwilling to say that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020. I also just saw a video today on Twitter, you know, those guys who like go around asking like politicians random questions. There's like a video of him confronting JD Vance and being like, did Donald Trump win the 2020 election? And JD Vance says yes. Yes. So that is deeply concerning. But make sure that you are finding some way to get involved, because clearly this is a situation, the same things that were happening in 2020, they are putting in motion to happen now. There's actually already litigation going on. And Mark Elias, who's like running that legal process for the campaign. Also, I think he's called Democracy Defenders or Democracy Docket. You can also follow him. They're doing a lot of legal work to address these challenges that are happening right now. But I will see y'all in about 3 hours. We'll come back. We'll pick up where we left off at the bottom of page 47. In the meantime, make sure you click that link on my page to download the document, right? So that you can follow along and read as well. But thank y'all so much. I'm glad that y'all have been here watching and following along with me. Also, let me know if it's helpful to have like this image here in the corner. I just want to make sure that y'all know that like I'm reading from the actual doc and I'm not like making things up. But I appreciate y'all so much, and I'll see y'all on the other side of this phone bank. All right, 7:30, 3 hours from now. We'll keep it up. Make sure you download it so that you can read along with us. All right, y'all be safe out there.